It was the year 1942. Deep in the dense jungles of Burma, the Burma Road stretched across 717 miles of unforgiving terrain, a narrow lifeline between British-held India and nationalist China. To the world, it was a forgotten corridor, overshadowed by larger battles unfolding in Europe and the Pacific. But for the men and women of the Allied forces, it was the key to survival. A road that cut through mountains, rainforests, and rivers, keeping them connected to the supplies and reinforcements they desperately needed. The Burma Road wasn't just another piece of land. It was a nerve-wracking, dangerous path that wound through some of the most rugged, impenetrable landscapes in the world. Lush green canopies hid treacherous cliffs below, and monsoon rains made the ground a thick, sucking mud. The path was narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and it was constantly threatened by the enemy. Japanese forces, determined to cut off this vital supply route, lurked in the dense undergrowth, waiting to strike, waiting to choke off the lifeline that fed the Allies' campaign in the Far East. It was here, on this forgotten road, that a battle was being waged not just against the enemy, but against time, nature, and the very concept of survival itself. The soldiers on the Burma Road were not only fighting against the advancing Japanese, but they were also battling an inhospitable environment that seemed determined to swallow them whole. The road itself had become a symbol of resilience, of the Allied forces' refusal to yield, no matter the odds. Despite its critical importance, the Burma Road was largely ignored by military strategists in favor of more high-profile campaigns. The British and American commanders knew that if they could keep this road open, they would maintain a steady flow of supplies, ammunition, food, medical supplies to the Chinese forces, who were fighting a desperate war against the Japanese in their homeland. Yet, too often, the road was viewed as a logistical afterthought, a backwater supply line that wasn't as glamorous as other fronts of the war. But the men on the ground, like the convoy that would later be tasked with a mission of near impossible odds, knew better. They understood that without this road, the war in China was as good as lost. It wasn't just the path to survival. It was the road that could turn the tide of the war in the East. Yet, as the Japanese closed in, the road remained an underappreciated, fragile hope in a world that had forgotten the value of its existence. The Burma Road was no ordinary supply line. It was a monster of geography, an unforgiving path carved through the heart of one of the most hostile terrains on Earth. As the Allies prepared to defend it, they faced an environment that seemed designed to destroy them. The dense jungle canopy, thick and unyielding, blocked out the sun, making the air heavy and damp. The road twisted and turned, climbing steep ridges and descending into valleys so deep that the fog lingered like a ghost, obscuring visibility. It wasn't just the natural obstacles that made the Burma Road so perilous. It was also the constant threat of enemy action. The Japanese forces had long recognized the road's strategic importance, and they were determined to neutralize it. For months, their soldiers had waged a relentless campaign of sabotage, planting mines, ambushing convoys, and launching surprise attacks. Anytime the Allied forces moved along the road, they did so with the constant knowledge that they could be struck at any moment. Even a simple convoy movement became an exercise in survival. The Allies had learned to move in darkness, navigating under cover of fog or rain. But even that didn't guarantee safety. The Japanese were always one step ahead, always lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting for an opportunity. The dangers weren't limited to the enemy alone. The weather, the very thing that made the jungle so thick, also worked against the Allies. Torrential rains would wash away sections of the road, leaving deep craters in the path and turning the ground into a sticky, boot-sucking quagmire. Landslides were a constant threat, as steep mountain slopes would collapse, blocking roads for days or even weeks at a time. And when the rain stopped, the heat became unbearable. The tropical sun, unfiltered by the canopy, beat down relentlessly on the convoy's men, their clothes soaked through with sweat, their energy sapped by the oppressive atmosphere. Then there were the rivers. The Burma Road passed through areas where rivers could swell without warning, flooding the road and making it impassable. Even crossing a relatively calm river was a gamble, as submerged rocks and swift currents could easily flip a jeep or stall an entire convoy. The narrowness of the road meant there was little room to maneuver, and any wrong move could lead to disaster. Morale was another constant battle. The soldiers who manned the road had no illusions about the dangers they faced. Every day was a struggle for survival, fighting the enemy, fighting the elements, fighting exhaustion. But despite the odds, they pushed on, because they knew the road's importance. They were the lifeline for the Chinese forces who depended on them, and that kept them going. But with every ambush, every blocked road, every foot of ground gained, the question grew louder in their minds. How much longer could they keep this road open, and at what cost? By December 1944, the Burma Road had become a symbol of everything the Allies were fighting for in the East. A connection to China that could help turn the tide of the war. But keeping the road open was no simple task. As the Japanese forces continued their relentless push across the region, the Allies found themselves on the back foot, scrambling to keep supply lines intact and their soldiers supplied with the critical resources they needed. It was against this backdrop of uncertainty and mounting pressure that a convoy of 800 jeeps was tasked with an almost impossible mission: to traverse the treacherous Burma Road and deliver vital supplies to the Chinese forces holed up in a besieged pocket of the region. The convoy, a sprawling collection of jeeps, trucks, and fuel tankers, was a motley crew of soldiers, drivers, and engineers, all carrying the weight of their mission on their shoulders. The convoy leader, a no-nonsense officer with a deep knowledge of the Burma Road's strategic importance, understood the gravity of what was at stake. This wasn't just about moving supplies. It was about ensuring that the Allies could maintain their presence in the region. Without these supplies, the Chinese forces would be left stranded, their lines cut off, and their morale shattered. The convoy's success or failure could directly impact the war effort in the Pacific. The soldiers in the convoy came from all walks of life. Some were seasoned veterans, battle-hardened from fighting in Europe and North Africa, while others were fresh-faced recruits, still coming to terms with the brutality of war. They had been trained for combat, but nothing could fully prepare them for the madness of what lay ahead. The road, already a graveyard of vehicles and shattered dreams. The convoy's mission wasn't just to drive through. It was to fight their way through, knowing that every mile was fraught with danger. The convoy's cargo was varied. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and fuel, everything needed to sustain the beleaguered Chinese forces as they fought back against the Japanese. The soldiers knew that the weight of the convoy wasn't just measured in pounds, it was measured in the lives it could save. Each jeep carried the hopes of thousands of soldiers, civilians, and allies. As the convoy set out, the atmosphere was a mix of apprehension and determination. They knew the dangers, ambushes, mines, and the threat of an enemy they could never quite see, but they had no choice. The mission had been ordered, and failure was not an option. As the convoy made its way along the Burma Road, the men spoke little. Words seemed unnecessary as the rumble of the engines and the hiss of the jungle filled the air. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep hills, narrow roads, and treacherous cliffs that seemed to threaten to swallow them whole. Yet, despite the hardships and the constant threat of death, the men pushed forward. They were driven by a sense of duty, a deep understanding that the success of their mission meant the survival of the forces fighting alongside them. The convoy leader, though a man of few words, kept the crew focused. He knew the road ahead would be long, perilous, and filled with moments that could easily turn into disasters. But he also knew that if anyone could make it, it was these men. They were the best the Allies had, and their resolve would be tested to the limit. The convoy set out early in the morning, the dim light of dawn barely piercing through the thick fog that clung to the jungle floor. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and the promise of another grueling day ahead. And supply vehicles began to rumble to life, engines sputtering in the cold, ready to carry the weight of a war on their backs. A sense of purpose filled the ranks, but so too did an undercurrent of anxiety. No one knew what awaited them, but everyone knew the stakes. The convoy had to make it through the Burma Road. There was no other option. As the vehicles began to snake through the narrow paths that cut through the dense foliage, the weight of their mission became all the more apparent. They were not just traveling from one point to another, they were heading into the heart of enemy territory, where any wrong move could lead to catastrophe. The road was long and winding, each turn offering a new set of challenges. Every corner held the potential for danger. Mines buried beneath the dirt, ambushes lurking in the thick jungle, and the ever-present threat of Japanese forces watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The convoy leader, a seasoned officer with a sharp mind and nerves of steel, kept a careful eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of trouble. His crew, a mix of battle-tested veterans and nervous rookies, were equally vigilant. There was no room for complacency. Every man in the convoy knew their role, and every action, every decision, had to be precise. They had trained for this moment, though no amount of preparation could fully equip them for the dangers that lay ahead. As the convoy pressed forward, the landscape seemed to close in around them. The jungle, dense and unyielding, was both a protective shield and a deadly trap. The trees towered over them, their limbs twisted into unnatural shapes, and the ground was a mix of slick mud and jagged rocks that threatened to send a vehicle skidding out of control at any moment. The convoy moved slowly, carefully, as the drivers fought against the elements, steering their vehicles over ruts and around fallen trees. There was no room for error. One misstep, one wrong turn, could send them careening into a ravine, or worse, straight into an enemy ambush. Despite the risks, there was a quiet camaraderie among the soldiers. As they traveled, they spoke little, but the bond between them was palpable. There was a shared understanding, no one needed to say it aloud, that each man was depending on the others to get through this alive. The soldiers, though tired and weary, carried their burdens without complaint. They had a job to do, and they knew that their success meant not only survival for their comrades, but also a critical victory in a war that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The convoy leader, whose mind never stopped calculating every possible outcome, glanced up at the overcast sky. The weather seemed to conspire against them. The clouds hung low, a heavy blanket threatening rain, but it was the mist that was the most unnerving. It shrouded everything, blurring the horizon, and made it nearly impossible to see what was ahead. The fog was both an ally and an enemy. It concealed their movements from the enemy, but it also made the already treacherous journey more dangerous. Every turn could hide a threat, and the convoy's pace was slower now, more deliberate, but there was no turning back. Every inch of ground gained brought them closer to their goal. As the convoy continued its march along the Burma Road, it became clear that the true test wasn't just the road or the enemy, it was the men themselves. Would they be able to keep moving forward, through the obstacles, through the danger, through the fear? The journey was far from over, and each man carried not only the weight of the supplies, but the responsibility of ensuring that they completed their mission and reached their destination. The convoy had been traveling for hours, the sound of engines echoing through the jungle as the mist began to lift. revealing glimpses of the rugged terrain ahead. They had crossed small streams and navigated tight corners where the trees seemed to close in around them. But the road had remained eerily quiet. There had been no sign of the enemy. The soldiers, their nerves already frayed from the constant pressure of the journey, began to let their guard down, if only slightly. But deep down, they all knew that danger could come at any moment, and soon enough, it did. It started with a distant rumble, barely audible over the sound of their engines, but it was enough to send a chill through the convoy. The convoy leader's eyes darted to the horizon, scanning the dense jungle for any sign of movement. His gut told him something was wrong, but it was too early to confirm anything. Then, the rumble grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable crackling of small arms fire. The soldiers stiffened. They had been expecting this after all. They were deep in enemy territory. The question wasn't if they'd be attacked, but when. The first shot came out of nowhere. A sharp crack of gunfire from the trees to their right, followed by the high-pitched whine of a bullet zipping through the air. It struck the jeep in front of them, sending a shower of sparks as the bullet tore through the metal. The convoy leader slammed his hand down on the radio, shouting for the convoy to halt. The convoy screeched to a halt, dust rising in the air as the men scrambled into defensive positions, their hearts racing with the adrenaline of combat. "Ambush!" one of the soldiers yelled, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. The enemy had found them, and they were already closing in, moving through the trees like shadows. The convoy leader's mind raced as he assessed the situation. There were no clear lines of sight, no place to maneuver. The trees, thick and imposing, made it nearly impossible to see the enemy, but the sound of gunfire and the flashes from muzzle bursts told him exactly where they were. The convoy leader knew they couldn't just sit and wait. They were trapped in the middle of a narrow stretch of road, exposed on all sides. The Japanese soldiers, familiar with the terrain, had the advantage of cover and concealment, but the convoy had something the enemy didn't: speed. The soldiers had trained for moments like this, and now was the time to put that training into action. "Return fire! Move out!" The order rang out through the convoy, and the soldiers responded immediately, their instincts kicking in. Gunfire erupted from the jeeps and trucks as they returned fire, but it was difficult to tell if they were hitting their targets in the dense fog and underbrush. The convoy leader, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, spotted a flash of light in the distance. It was an enemy machine gun nest, well hidden, but just visible enough to target. Without hesitation, the convoy leader gave the signal, and the convoy responded as one. The men inside the jeeps and trucks worked like a well-oiled machine, coordinating their movements and laying down suppressive fire. They needed to break the enemy's hold on the road, and they had to do it fast. Every second counted. The firefight raged on for what felt like an eternity, with gunfire crisscrossing through the trees. The convoy, despite the ambush, held their ground, but as the seconds ticked by, the leader knew that if they didn't break free soon, the enemy would overrun them. There was no room for hesitation. The convoy had to move, and they had to move now. "Go, go, go," he barked, urging the drivers forward. The engines roared to life once again, and the convoy surged ahead, the men still firing from the moving vehicles, trying to create a path through the barrage of enemy fire. The trees seemed to shake with the intensity of the battle, but the convoy kept pushing forward, determined not to let this ambush become their final stop. The jungle, once a maze of beauty and danger, now felt like a battlefield that would determine the fate of their mission. But in this chaos, one thing was clear. The convoy had just come face to face with the enemy, and the war was about to get much harder. By the time the convoy reached the heart of the jungle, the threat of ambush had become a constant presence. The men had grown accustomed to the tension, the feeling that danger was lurking just beyond the tree line, always one step ahead. Yet, despite their readiness, nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. The road, narrow and winding, twisted deeper into the jungle, and the sense of claustrophobia grew. The dense trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to block out what little light was left, casting the convoy in an oppressive, suffocating darkness. It was then that disaster struck. A sharp, piercing crack sounded from the front of the convoy, followed by the unmistakable screech of tires on the slick mud. One of the jeeps had gone off the road, its tires sliding on the wet ground before it slammed into a thick tree. The convoy leader's heart dropped as he saw the vehicle precariously positioned at the edge of a steep ravine. The vehicle's front end was dangling over the edge, teetering dangerously, while the men inside scrambled to escape. The jeep had become a roadblock, and with it, their only escape route had been cut off. The convoy screeched to a halt, the sound of engines dying down as the men assessed the situation. The soldiers, now fully alert, quickly leapt out of their vehicles and began to work, but there was no time to waste. The convoy leader, his face tight with concern, immediately barked orders for the convoy to form a defensive perimeter around the jeep. Their backs were now against the jungle, no way forward, no way back. They were trapped. The soldiers worked furiously, trying to secure the jeep and prevent it from sliding any further. But the rain had made the ground slippery, and the steepness of the ravine made the operation even more dangerous. As the men scrambled, the realization hit them. They had no clear escape. The enemy, who had been lurking in the trees, now had them cornered. The jungle, which had once seemed like a shield, now felt like a prison. The convoy leader surveyed the situation, his mind racing. The Japanese forces, sensing the opportunity, had already begun to close in. From the thick underbrush, small arms fire erupted, striking a few of the jeeps on the outskirts of the convoy. The men ducked, instinctively reaching for their rifles, but there was no cover. The trees, which had once seemed like an advantage, now felt like they were closing in on them from every side. The leader's pulse quickened as he realized the magnitude of their predicament. They had been too slow. The convoy, once a well-oiled machine, had become a sitting target. They were vulnerable, exposed, and the clock was ticking. It wasn't just a matter of enemy fire anymore. It was a matter of time. The convoy's position was becoming increasingly untenable. The longer they stayed in one place, the more the Japanese forces would regroup and organize for a full assault. They needed to move now. But how? The convoy leader's mind flashed back to the training, to the countless hours spent preparing for the unexpected. They had always been told to keep moving, to never stop, to stay one step ahead of the enemy. But now they were stuck, and there was no room for hesitation. He knew the cost of a wrong decision could mean the end of the convoy, the end of their mission. As the gunfire intensified, the leader made the call. It was a risk, a dangerous one, but it was their only chance. "We move out now," he ordered, his voice steely with determination. "Get those jeeps back on the road, and don't look back." The convoy surged into action. Men scrambled to jump back into their vehicles, their nerves on edge. The jeeps roared to life, engines sputtering but holding steady. The convoy leader glanced once more at the edge of the ravine. The jeep was still teetering on the brink, but it had to be left behind. With a final, tense moment of silence, the convoy pushed forward, ignoring the sounds of enemy fire and the growing panic in the air. Every second was a gamble, but it was a gamble they had no choice but to take. The jungle that had once seemed so thick and protective now felt like a death trap, but they had no other option but to fight through it. They were trapped, yes, but they hadn't given up yet. Not by a long shot. The convoy moved in fits and starts, the engines roaring to life, then stalling as the drivers tried to maneuver through the mud and debris that now littered the once clear path. Every movement was deliberate, the air thick with tension. The convoy leader's mind raced as he scanned the dense trees that now felt like walls closing in around them. The Japanese forces, sensing the vulnerability of the convoy, had intensified their assault, and the soldiers were starting to feel the weight of the enemy's pressure. The convoy had broken free from the ravine, but they were far from safe. They were still deep in enemy territory, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. Every inch they gained was met with gunfire. Every turn was met with the threat of an ambush. The soldiers inside the convoy fought the urge to panic, knowing that the success of the mission now hinged on one thing: speed. But speed wasn't enough. They needed to act strategically. The convoy leader knew that if they were to have any chance of survival, they had to take the fight to the enemy. The road had already become a death trap, and retreat was no longer an option. They had to break through the Japanese lines and push forward, no matter the cost. Without missing a beat, the convoy leader gave the order. "Form up! Engage the enemy!" he shouted, his voice steady, despite the chaos that surrounded them. With that command, the soldiers in the convoy sprang into action, using the terrain to their advantage. They weren't just driving, now they were fighters. The jeeps and trucks swerved in and out of trees, taking cover in the shadow of the thick underbrush. The soldiers leaned out of the vehicles, firing their weapons at the Japanese positions, while the vehicles themselves became mobile targets for the enemy to aim at. Every inch of the road was now a battlefield. The first few shots from the convoy hit their marks, sending explosions and fireballs into the jungle as they struck enemy positions hidden deep in the trees. The convoy had become a blur of motion, flashes of gunfire, the rumble of engines, and the roar of explosions. The soldiers, now fully engaged, worked together in sync, their training coming to life as they targeted Japanese positions with precision. The Japanese, disoriented by the sudden ferocity of the convoy's response, began to retreat, but not without resistance. The enemy fired back, and the battle raged on. The convoy leader's heart raced as he realized just how close they were to the tipping point. They could push forward, but at what cost? It was a brutal dance of strategy and chaos, each side calculating their next move, each trying to outmaneuver the other. The convoy leader knew this wasn't a battle they could win by sheer force. It was a battle of attrition, and their best bet was to break the Japanese formation, to create chaos in their ranks, to give the convoy the chance it needed to break free. Then it happened. The convoy leader spotted an opening, a gap in the enemy's defenses, a small window of opportunity. "Take the left flank," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise of the battle. His eyes locked onto the gap in the line. The convoy surged forward, cutting through the enemy's formation like a knife through butter. With precision and speed, they broke through the Japanese line, forcing the enemy to scramble in confusion. The sound of gunfire subsided as the convoy continued to push forward, the once tight and disciplined Japanese formation now in disarray. The convoy leader exhaled, his heart still pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of victory now, faint but unmistakable. The road ahead was still dangerous, but they had managed to break through the worst of the enemy's forces. For a brief moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of engines and the soldiers' labored breathing. The battle wasn't over yet, but the convoy had made a decisive move. They had fought their way through, against all odds, and as the fog of war cleared, the men in the convoy knew one thing for certain. They weren't going to let this road or their mission slip through their fingers. They had taken the fight to the enemy, and now they had a fighting chance to complete their mission. The convoy had broken through the enemy lines, but the victory was far from certain. The tension was still thick, the jungle still alive with the echo of gunfire, the rumble of engines, and the steady hiss of steam rising from overheating engines. As the convoy continued forward, their progress was slow, but each inch gained brought them closer to their destination and to safety. The men in the convoy, once on edge, now felt a shift in the air. The immediate threat of destruction had passed, but the fight wasn't over yet. As the convoy pressed on, they began to see the results of their desperate push. The once cluttered road ahead began to clear. The enemy's resistance had started to crumble as their carefully laid plans to ambush the convoy unraveled in the face of a bold, calculated counterattack. What had been a tightly controlled line of defense was now fragmented and disoriented. The Japanese forces, thrown off balance by the sudden ferocity of the convoy's response, had begun to scatter, retreating deeper into the jungle. Their organized resistance had given way to panic. The convoy leader, still tense but now more focused than ever, surveyed the road ahead. He could feel the weight of their mission lifting with every passing moment. But he knew the true victory wouldn't come until they had delivered their supplies to the Chinese forces who were waiting on the other side of the jungle. There was no room for celebration yet, not while they were still in enemy territory. The convoy's final stretch to their destination was met with an eerie silence. Gone were the enemy's sudden bursts of fire. Gone were the hidden traps and ambushes. The Japanese forces had been routed, and though a few pockets of resistance remained, their hold on the road had been broken. The men of the convoy, exhausted and battered, maintained their vigilance. They were almost there. By the time they reached the edge of the jungle, the convoy had been reduced in number. Several jeeps had been abandoned, some heavily damaged or disabled in the fight, and a few soldiers had fallen along the way. But they had done it. The road to the besieged Chinese forces was now open, and the convoy's mission had been completed. The supplies, desperately needed for survival, were now on their way. As the convoy leader and his men made contact with the Chinese forces, the atmosphere shifted. There were no grand celebrations or loud cheers. The soldiers of the convoy, tired and scarred from their journey, simply stood quietly, exchanging brief nods and words of thanks with their Chinese counterparts. The real victory wasn't in the gesture, it was in the knowledge that their bravery and sacrifice had made this moment possible. They had saved lives. They had turned the tide. Back at Allied headquarters, word of the convoy's success spread quickly. What had seemed like an impossible mission, one fraught with peril and doubt, had turned into a resounding victory. In the aftermath, the higher-ups began to take notice of the convoy's unconventional tactics, especially the bold counterattack and the precision with which the convoy had dismantled the Japanese assault. While the men didn't seek recognition, their success became a pivotal moment in the campaign. But the convoy leader knew there was something more important than medals or praise. They had lived. They had fought through one of the most dangerous stretches of war in the jungle and come out on the other side, not just as survivors, but as heroes. As they moved back to base, weary and battered, the leader reflected on how close they had come to failure, how their decision to fight back when all seemed lost had been the turning point. The road to the Chinese forces had been opened once more. The convoy had delivered its supplies, and in the end, the mission had been a success. The journey had been long, the battle fierce, but they had done it. They had saved more than just a road. They had preserved a lifeline that would continue to sustain the Allies' efforts, and in that, they had changed the course of the war in the region. The victory was theirs, but the price had been steep, and the cost of the Burma Road of courage, sacrifice, and survival would not be forgotten.